Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes reality can be more disturbing than any thriller? Before I tell you this story, I want to ask you a question. Are you subscribed to this channel yet? If not, take advantage now, because this case will keep you hooked from start to finish, and I guarantee you won't want to miss the next mysteries we'll unravel together. Oh, and please leave a like and a comment, because that really helps spread this content and strengthen our investigative community. What I'm going to share today is more than just an investigation. It's a story that blends crime, psychology, and even paranormal phenomena, with twists and turns that defy logic. And here's a paradox: the more you believe you have the answer, the more you realize you haven't understood anything. Sounds like an exaggeration? Just wait until you see the details I uncovered. The press tried to reduce the case to superficial labels: suicide, kidnapping, hysteria. But the truth, or rather the truths, are much more disturbing. This isn't just a police report. It's a delve into psychological trauma, hidden secrets, and clues that seem to have been left intentionally to confuse anyone who dared investigate. And perhaps most disturbingly, this story may reveal more about you than you realize. Because deep down, we've all felt the presence of shadows we can't explain. The question is, would you have the courage to face them to the end? It was a rainy night, the kind when the city seems to swallow its own secrets in the sound of thunder. I was reviewing some old reports when the phone rang. A student had disappeared without a trace. The detail that caught my attention: she'd vanished just meters from the university, a place that should symbolize safety, but that night became the stage for a dark mystery. This kind of case always ignites an almost visceral investigative instinct in me. When I arrived at the scene, I found only puddles reflecting the streetlights, as if curious eyes were observing the scene. No sign of a struggle, no clear testimony, nothing but a glaring absence. The feeling was that the young woman had been swallowed by the air itself. I've seen many disappearances, but this one had a strangeness that couldn't be explained with simple logic. It was as if reality had a crack at that corner. As I spoke with the police, I realized the rush to file the case as a voluntary escape was already setting in. This is a common mistake. When there's no blood, people assume there's no crime. But as an investigator, I've learned to listen to the silence. And that night, the silence spoke louder than any physical evidence. Whenever you come across something seemingly trivial, remember the absence of evidence is also a clue. There, faced with a wet night and an empty street, I sensed this case wasn't just about a missing young woman. Intuitively, I understood there was something bigger, something far beyond what the naked eye could see. And if there's a lesson here, it's that every simple beginning hides layers of complexity that only reveal themselves to those who insist on looking deeper. It was then that I decided to dive headfirst into this mystery, even knowing the next step could lead me into even darker territory. Meeting the victim is like opening the first door of a maze. Only when we understand who she was do we begin to see what may have led to her disappearance. The young woman in question was a psychology student, intelligent, dedicated, and with a promising future. However, like many faces that appear perfect on the outside, there were invisible scars on the inside. Since childhood, she lived with inner ghosts, childhood traumas that manifested in anxiety attacks and episodes of disturbing hallucinations. Many colleagues saw her as different. Some described her as too deep for her age, others as someone who seemed to live between two worlds, the real and the imaginary. This intrigued me, because as an investigator, I'd learned that a person's past is never truly buried. It seeps into every decision, every relationship, and even every step taken down a dark street. Her mind was a puzzle that needed to be deciphered. In her academic records, I noticed an unusual fixation. She was interested precisely in perceptual disorders, as if she were trying to understand herself through science. It wasn't uncommon to find her immersed in books on trauma psychology or articles on out-of-body experiences. Some professors admired her dedication, others whispered that there was something disturbing about her relentless search for answers. And I frankly wondered, how far was she willing to go to understand her own chaos? This complex profile not only illuminated aspects of his personality, but also opened doors to more delicate lines of investigation. After all, a history of hallucinations can be both a clinical symptom and a gateway to experiences that defy logic. And suddenly, I realized that what seemed like just a police investigation could turn into a journey into the limits of the human mind, and perhaps even beyond. Tracing a victim's last movements is like following footprints in the sand. The more time passes, the more the wind tries to erase them. In this young woman's case, I discovered that the last people to see her noticed her near an old, abandoned train station, a place forgotten by time, where the echo of the tracks seems to carry stories no one dares tell. She was there, alone, but she didn't seem alone. Witnesses said she was talking to herself, gesturing as if responding to someone invisible. This scene reminded me of other cases in which people, moments before disappearing, acted strangely disconnected from reality. Some call it delirium, others a trance. But as an investigator, I've learned not to rule out the possibility that the inexplicable. After all, how many times have you caught yourself talking to yourself out loud, only to realize you seem to be in a dialogue with a non-existent presence? Small everyday details hide great mysteries. The train station itself carried a heavy energy. Rusted doors, obscure graffiti, and that heavy silence that only abandoned places possess. It wasn't the kind of place someone would choose to reflect on life, unless they were being drawn there by some. Witnesses reported feeling chills upon seeing her there, as if the space around them had become colder. Coincidence? Perhaps, but I've learned that coincidences in investigations are rarely just that. As I wrote down each statement, I realized that the station wasn't just a setting, but a character in this story. The young woman wasn't just talking to herself, she seemed to be answering a silent summons. And if that place held buried secrets, I knew that sooner or later, I would have to enter it too, even if it meant facing shadows that didn't belong solely to the past. I always say that no investigation truly begins in the present. The past is fertile ground, full of seeds that germinate in unexpected ways. In the young woman's case, her family had a delicate history, parents separated from an early age, a deeply religious mother, and a virtually absent father, marked by episodes of aggressive behavior. This trio of circumstances creates an emotional stew that inevitably leaves its mark on anyone's identity. The mother, it seemed, sought faith in an attempt to shield her daughter from the ghosts within. She prayed for her, filled the house with religious symbols, and believed her daughter possessed an unusual spiritual sensitivity. The father, however, when he appeared, was more shadow than presence, a man who carried with him the tension of someone who never learned to love without hurt. His silence spoke too loudly in the corridors of the young woman's memory. In conversations with neighbors and relatives, I noticed that family conflicts were discussed in whispers. The constant fighting, the heavy looks, the nighttime escapes, all of this created an atmosphere of instability. And as an investigator, I know that families guard secrets, like walls guard cracks. You can paint over them, but the fissure always reappears. The young woman grew up in this environment, between fervent faith and latent violence, trying to build her own narrative. This explosive mix of absence, rigidity, and silent pain can lead someone to seek refuge in alternate worlds, whether in religion, science, or even paranormal experience. As I connected these dots, one question kept running through my mind. Was her disappearance merely the culmination of an internal escape that began years ago within her own home? Few things capture my attention as much as objects left behind in missing persons cases. When I found the young woman's backpack in a damp alley, I immediately felt that chill down my spine that only years of investigative experience can bring. It wasn't simply abandoned, it seemed to have been placed there on purpose, almost like a mess. Inside, I found notebooks, some ordinary notes, but also torn, loose pages, as if someone wanted to hide or reveal only fragments of a story. Most intriguing, however, were the symbols scrawled on loose sheets of paper. They weren't simple drawings, they had geometric, almost ritualistic lines, interspersed with disconnected phrases. I've investigated cases where such symbols were linked to obscure cults or depth psychology studies, used to represent trauma. The detail is that these scribbles didn't just seem random, there was an obsessive repetition in some of them, as if they carried a coded message. As I leafed through those papers, I remembered an old case in which a young woman with emotional disturbances incessantly drew the same circular pattern. Later, we discovered that it represented her attempt to control her inner chaos. Did this student do the same, or was something or someone inducing her to write that? It's curious how certain signs can be both a key to the unconscious and an open door to the inexplicable. The seemingly mundane backpack became an essential artifact of the investigation. It didn't speak, but it screamed through its symbols, its tears, and its deliberate abandonment. And it was then that I realized, every detail of that object could lead me to a loose thread capable of unraveling the entire plot. The question was, how far would that thread lead me? Finding the young woman's diary was like opening a secret window into her soul. The first few pages seemed ordinary, routine notes, reflections on college, short rants, typical of someone her age. But as I progressed, the tone changed drastically. She described repetitive dreams, where shadows watched her from the dark corners of endless hallways. It was as if a constant presence haunted her, calling her softly by name, night after night. What struck me was the richness of the detail. She recorded every sensation, the chill that ran down her spine, the heaviness in her chest, the voice that seemed sometimes feminine, sometimes masculine, but always insistent. For some, this kind of story is simply a psychological symptom. For others, it's proof that there's something beyond what meets the eye. I've investigated cases where dreams were simply manifestations of trauma, but I've also come across stories where they seemed like disguised premonition. As I read, I felt as if the diary wasn't just an intimate confession, but a cry for help. It was clear she was struggling between believing she was going crazy and actually being haunted by something invisible. This dilemma is powerful because it reflects a conflict we've all experienced at some level. Are our fears just figments of our imagination, or signals that we need to pay attention to what we're ignoring? Each line carried a sense of urgency, as if she knew she was being slowly swallowed by forces she didn't understand. And it was at that moment that I understood the diary wasn't just a record, it was a kind of map, a key piece that could lead me to something greater. The question, how far was this map willing to take me? I always say that, in any investigation, understanding who the victim was associated with is like opening hidden doors. In this young woman's case, one name frequently appeared in the reports, a classmate, known for his obsession with the occult. It was no secret among the students that he spent hours discussing rituals, symbols, and ancient esoteric practices, and in the last days before her disappearance, he was seen in close contact with her, as if they were sharing secrets no one else could hear. This kind of figure always catches my attention. I've dealt with people like this in other investigations, individuals who seem harmless at first glance, but who cultivate a strange aura of mystery. He spoke of portals, energies, and invisible forces with the same ease others discuss football or politics. The detail is that the young woman seemed to have approached him just as his dreams began to intensify. Coincidence? I wouldn't say so. I spoke with some classmates, and they all described this young man as charismatic yet unsettling. Some said he believed he had a spiritual mission, others, that he was just an eccentric with time on his hands. But for me, what mattered was his connection to the symbols found in his backpack. The scribbled shapes were very reminiscent of the drawings he used to carry in his notebooks, almost like an invisible signature. It was impossible to ignore this connection. And as I pieced together every detail about this mysterious colleague, I began to realize that his presence in the plot wasn't merely incidental. On the contrary, he seemed to be a central figure, perhaps even the catalyst for something much larger. The question that remained was he simply exploring academic curiosities, or had he crossed the dangerous line between study and practice? When I mapped out the events, I noticed a detail that couldn't be ignored. The abandoned station where the young woman was last seen wasn't just a gloomy setting. In the 1980s, this same location had been the scene of mysterious disappearances, all unsolved. It was as if that space were marked, a point of intersection between what we know and what we prefer not to name. Some call this a historical coincidence. I prefer to call it a pattern. Old files revealed eerily similar cases. Young people who disappeared without explanation, always near that station, always on nights of unstable weather. Investigations at the time were hushed up due to lack of evidence, but there were reports from residents who swore they heard voices, saw figures, and felt heavy presences in that area. It's not uncommon to find places where time seems to accumulate tragedies like dust on forgotten furniture. This was one of them. Talking to former police officers and residents was like opening a book of forbidden stories. Each had a different memory, but they all converged on a common feeling: fear. Some said the station was cursed, others believed it was used by secret groups for strange practices. The fact is, the succession of disappearances made it clear that there was something there that went beyond mere coincidence. As I connected the past disappearances to the current case, I realized I wasn't just investigating the disappearance of a student, but rather a cycle that repeated itself, generation after generation. The most disturbing thing was the thought, if there's a pattern, perhaps there was already a next target, and that thought alone made the darkness seem even denser around me. If there's one thing that always worries me, it's the way certain cases are handled by the police. In the case of this young woman's disappearance, Their initial approach was dismissive. They considered it a case of voluntary absconding. To them, a student with a history of instability could simply have decided to disappear. This seemingly bureaucratic decision proved costly. The first hours, the most crucial in any investigation, were wasted on internal debates and superficial reports. I've seen this movie before. Institutional slowness often stems from a fear of commitment or a lack of preparation to deal with complex situations. But what struck me was the coldness with which they dismissed the case as another troubled young woman. This approach reveals something important. When we underestimate the signs, we miss the chance to prevent greater tragedy. And this applies not only to criminal investigations, but also to life. How many times have you overlooked a detail that later turned out to be crucial? As the officers hesitated, I knew that every minute was taking away the chance of finding her alive. Witnesses scattered, memories blurred, and the trail quickly grew cold. It felt like swimming against the tide, trying to rescue fragments of truth before they were swallowed by oblivion. I learned in those moments that patience is a virtue, but urgency is survival. The balance between the two is what separates a successful investigation from an unanswered tragedy. It was in this context of omission that I decided to intensify my own search. If the police saw escape, I saw disappearance. If they saw psychological disorder, I saw and in that moment, I understood that I was alone against time, a relentless enemy that with every second, seemed to erase the footprints left by the young woman on that rainy night. Investigations are like puzzles. Sometimes the missing piece isn't the most obvious, but the one that almost goes unnoticed. This was precisely the case when forensics found partial fingerprints on a handrail near the station, fragmented, smudged by humidity, but still present. The most intriguing detail, they didn't match any immediate records, and worse, were positioned in a way that suggested haste, almost as if someone had been holding onto them to keep from falling. But that wasn't all. Near the marks, bloodstains caught my attention. Initially, I thought they might be the young woman's, but the analysis was categorical. The blood wasn't hers. This fact opened up a range of disturbing possibilities. Someone had been there, injured, possibly in a confrontation. If there was another body involved, where was it? And why had the scene been so quickly dismissed as irrelevant by the authorities? This discovery reminded me of other cases, where small biological clues were the key to untying enormous knots. The body may disappear, but blood is stubborn. It tells stories no one wants to hear. A single drop can carry the weight of an entire truth. It's almost poetic to think about it. The truth always leaves its mark, even when they try to erase it. Looking at those stains and prints, I felt the investigation had shifted gears. It was no longer a simple search for a missing student. Now we were faced with a scene of possible violence, and every detail screamed that there was much more to it. The question was, who owned that blood, and why was it so closely linked to her disappearance? When I began talking to residents near the station, I realized the investigation would take an unexpected turn. Many were reluctant to speak, lowering their eyes as if afraid of awakening something dormant. But gradually, reports emerged. A female figure, always in a school uniform, would appear on the quietest nights, walking alone along the rusty tracks. The description eerily matched the missing young woman. Was it just popular imagination, or were we dealing with something beyond the ordinary? These stories don't surprise me. I've been to other places where the inexplicable blends into people's daily lives. In these situations, residents learn to live with the mystery, creating their own rules. Don't look directly, don't talk about it out loud, don't cross certain points at night. It's curious how human beings create silent pacts with the unknown to keep living, and perhaps, deep down, everyone knows more than they dare admit. One detail caught my attention. The apparitions always occurred at similar times, almost like a ritual. Some said she simply walked. Others swore she was crying softly, and there were even those who claimed to hear a whisper calling their own name shortly after seeing her disappear. It's hard to ignore the repetition of these accounts when they come from different people, with nothing in common other than a shared fear. As I gathered each witness, I sensed that the case was no longer limited to the realm of forensics. Something deeper, more complex was at play. Whether it was the product of the collective mind or a real manifestation didn't matter at that moment. The fact was that the apparitions could not be ignored. The question that lingered was, were we facing a supernatural clue or a collective psychological echo fueled by the tragedy? One of the most delicate threads of this investigation emerged when I discovered that the young woman suffered from dissociation attacks. For those unfamiliar with the term, it's as if the mind, at certain moments, disconnects from reality to protect itself. The body is present, but consciousness wanders elsewhere, disconnected. This detail raised an intriguing hypothesis. Could she have simply fled, not by rational choice, but because she was in an altered state? Reviewing medical records and reports from close colleagues, I realized these episodes weren't uncommon. She would sometimes walk for hours without knowing where she was going, or be found in strange places with no memory of how she got there. This made the line between voluntary disappearance and abduction even more blurred. I've investigated cases myself, where the missing person had unknowingly put themselves in risky situations because of a similar disorder, but there was something peculiar about this case. Her reports of dissociation were accompanied by visions and voices, far beyond what one would normally expect. The young woman wasn't just disconnecting, she seemed to be immersed in a parallel world, full of symbols, shadows, and presences. This made me wonder, to what extent can we call a disease what may be a rare sensitivity to perceived dimensions most of us ignore? It's an uncomfortable but inevitable question. As I analyzed this psychological line, I realized it didn't explain everything, but rather added layers of complexity. If her mind could create parallel realities, was her disappearance the result of an unconscious escape, or something much darker that exploited her weaknesses to manifest itself? It was impossible to ignore the repeated reports, nighttime meetings, abandoned buildings, strangely dressed young people, symbols drawn on the ground. At first it seemed like a typical small-town rumor, but the more I investigated, the more details emerged that couldn't be mere coincidence. I discovered that the young woman had been seen accompanying colleagues to a disused warehouse just days before her disappearance. This type of cult is nothing new to me. I've investigated groups that blend occultism, experimental psychology, and even power plays disguised as spirituality. The line between a search for answers and manipulation is very thin. The detail is that, in these meetings, symbols similar to those in her backpack were drawn in circles as part of summoning rituals. Everything seemed to connect in an eerily precise way. I spoke with some students who admitted to participating, and they all described a heavy atmosphere. The candles, the chanting and strange languages, the profound silence preceding the rituals. Some left laughing, thinking it was a joke, but others confessed to feeling chills and a sense of being watched. It's curious how human beings, in their eagerness to belong, end up subjecting themselves to experiences they don't even fully understand. Realizing that the young woman was at the center of this circle made me wonder, was she seeking answers to her own torments, or had she become a pawn in a larger game, driven by forces human or otherwise, that knew exactly where she was most vulnerable? Soon the young woman's disappearance went from being merely an investigation to a spectacle. Sensational headlines filled newspapers and TV shows, each pushing the story in the direction that garnered the most views. Some outlets reported a kidnapping, highlighting theories of human trafficking. Others suggested suicide, exploring her psychological history, and to top it all off, there were those who fueled the public imagination with paranormal hypotheses. The press turned pain into fuel. The problem is that when the media gets involved, public opinion is divided. On the streets, I heard people saying she was asking to disappear because she was involved in strange things. Others believed she was the victim of a powerful criminal network. And there were still those who swore the case was proof of a supernatural presence stalking the city. It's amazing how each person only sees what confirms their own beliefs. I'd seen this before. The media creates characters, the victim becomes heroine, martyr, or villain, depending on the chosen narrative. The audience, in turn, consumes the story as if it were a thriller, forgetting that real lives are at stake. Ultimately, this polarization not only hinders the investigation, but also fuels rumors that spread faster than any concrete evidence. As I followed the flood of stories, I realized that each media version was a smokescreen. For me, the truth lay in the quiet details, not the screaming headline. But I confess, sometimes I wonder if the overexposure wasn't part of the mystery itself, as if someone had an interest in confusing, dividing, and further delaying the search. Few things have the power to generate as much unrest as an anonymous message. On the young woman's cell phone, recovered by experts, there were records of short texts, always sent at odd hours of the morning. The most striking one read, "They're coming for you," no identification, no context, no traceable a direct, cold message that seemed more like a threat than a warning. Reading it, I felt the same chill anyone would feel upon receiving something like that. I investigated whether there were patterns in these messages. Some came in sequence, others in isolation, always carrying a scrutinizing tone, as if someone knew exactly what she was doing and was waiting for the right moment to remind her. I've dealt with stalking cases before, but here there was a difference, the feeling that the messages weren't just coming from a human stalker, but from something larger, as if an entity were speaking through the digital world. It may seem exaggerated, but in investigations, the absurd is sometimes the closest thing to the truth. It's curious to note that, days before her disappearance, she confided in colleagues that she was being followed. No one took her seriously, thinking it was a result of her crisis, but the messages lend credibility to her fear. Whoever sent them knew too much. The schedule, the routine, even the tone of their words seemed calculated to weaken her. This made me reflect on how, in our own lives, we ignore warning signs because they seem exaggerated until it's too late. Each letter of these messages felt like a silent scream. They showed that she was, indeed, on someone's or something's radar. And for me, they remained a crucial piece of the puzzle because they revealed that the young woman hadn't disappeared by chance. A hunt was underway. The remaining question was, who, after all, were they? When I began investigating the young woman's academic life, I encountered a resistance that struck me as suspicious, to say the least. Professors who had previously been helpful suddenly avoided questions. Some changed the subject, others responded with short, almost rehearsed sentences. The common thread: they were all connected to the university's psychology lab. It was as if there was something there no one wanted to expose, and in my experience, when silence is unanimous, the truth is loud. I discovered that, in the months leading up to her disappearance, the laboratory had intensified research into altered states of consciousness. Experiments involving sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and even lucid dreaming were conducted with few official records. The young woman, apparently, not only knew about these studies but also participated as a volunteer. This explained much about the accounts in her diary and the fine line between hallucination and expanded perception. The problem was that the more I pressed, the more obvious the effort to suppress information became. Files disappeared, reports were incomplete, and even internal camera recordings showed technical glitches. I've seen this before. When institutions feel exposed, bureaucracy becomes the best smokescreen. But for me, each lost document was further confirmation that there was something worth unearthing. The feeling was that I wasn't just dealing with a disappearance, but with a network that went beyond the young woman's personal drama. The laboratory didn't seem just a space for academic research, it was as if it also functioned as a testing ground, where ethical boundaries had been blurred. And the question that haunted me was simple and disturbing: how much of what she experienced was a consequence of her own frailties, and how much was induced by hands that should have protected her. While analyzing the young woman's cell phone, something caught the expert's attention: an audio file recorded days before her disappearance. Curiously, there was no associated call log, as if someone had managed to insert the recording there, bypassing the normal channel. When I played it back, I felt a shiver run down my spine. A distorted metallic voice was speaking to her. It wasn't a monologue, it was a dialogue, but the other person wasn't identified. The most disturbing thing was hearing the young woman respond. She spoke softly, almost pleadingly. Words like, "I don't want it anymore and this isn't right," emerged amidst the hissing. The distorted voice, in contrast, repeated enigmatic phrases: "It's already started, you can't go back." This type of material completely changes the course of an investigation, because it proves that there was a hidden interlocutor, someone who was putting direct pressure on her. I've dealt with interceptions and manipulated audio in other cases, but there was something different about this one. The sound didn't just seem digitally altered, it was as if the voice itself were impossible to be human, low, slurred, almost hypnotic. The kind of thing that unnerves even a seasoned investigator. The question was inevitable: were we dealing with a person masking their identity, or with something that simply didn't fit conventional logic? As I listened repeatedly, I noticed noises in the background. Footsteps, perhaps the creaking of a door, the echo of an empty space. This recording wasn't just a clue, it was a scene captured in sound fragments, and I knew that if I could decipher every detail of that audio, perhaps I would find the key to revealing who or what was on the other end of the line. Every investigation has a turning point, And in this case, it came from where it was least expected, the young woman's best friend. Until then, she had been cooperative, but also very nervous. In a private conversation, after hours of uncomfortable silence, she finally opened up. She confessed to having participated in hypnotic induction experiments with the victim. She wasn't just a distant accomplice, but someone directly involved in something that could have opened very dangerous doors. According to her, it all began almost innocently. The two were interested in experimental psychology and believed they could explore altered states of mind. At first, they were simple relaxation sessions and exercises to study concentration. But little by little, the practices evolved into something more profound: long hypnosis, regressions, and even attempts to access forgotten memory. And it was then that the young woman began reporting increasingly disturbing visions. The friend described moments when the victim, in a trance, spoke in different voices, mentioned places she had never visited, and in some cases, seemed to interact with invisible presences in the environment. She herself admitted to being frightened, but the fascination with the unknown spoke louder. The dilemma was clear: were they exploring their minds, or unwittingly, opening channels to something they had no control over? This line between science and mysticism has always intrigued me. This confession changed everything. Until then, I'd been investigating external clues, messages, symbols, witnesses. Now I realized that the victim's closest link was engaged in practices that could explain or intensify her disappearance. But more than answers, the testimony raised new questions. If the young woman accessed something during these hypnotic states, what exactly did she respond to on the other side? Few things shake up an investigation as much as the discovery of a body. The news came like a bolt of lightning. A young woman had been found in similar conditions to the missing woman. For a moment, I thought the case was close to a painful, yet definitive answer. However, the forensic examinations were clear: it wasn't her. The victim found was someone else, unknown, close in age and appearance, a mistake that, rather than alleviate the situation, only deepened the mystery. The impact was immediate. The police were distraught, the press rushed to publish even more sensational headlines, and residents began whispering about a curse linked to the place. For me, the situation was a turning point. Now I wasn't investigating just one disappearance, but possibly a network of disappearances, deaths, and cover-ups. What had seemed like an isolated case took on frightening proportions. I remember staring at the body in the morgue. Even without knowing her, I felt the strange connection of two stories intertwined by fate. It was impossible to ignore the physical similarities, almost as if someone wanted to confuse the clues, create a false trail. I've seen this in cases of criminal manipulation, where chaos is used as a smokescreen to hinder any logical line of investigation. The revelation that it wasn't the missing girl didn't bring relief, but rather greater anguish. It meant she was still out there somewhere, alive or not, and that there were more pieces to this puzzle than I'd imagined. The question that echoed was brutal: if this body wasn't hers, then whose was it? And how did this death connect to the original disappearance? As I pieced together the last pieces, I realized the young woman's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. In different cities, similar cases were surfacing in old files. Students, always with delicate psychological histories, vanishing under mysterious circumstances. The accounts had eerie commonalities: abandoned locations, repeated symbols, anonymous messages. It was as if a pattern was hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone stubborn enough to see it. I sifted through forgotten documents in police station archives in the interior, listened to hushed testimonies, and compared overlooked details. The feeling was clear: there was a network behind these cases, perhaps larger than any local investigation could encompass. This wasn't just about a missing young woman, but about a sequence of events spanning decades, perhaps generations. Each clue echoed something orchestrated with disturbing precision. This discovery didn't bring definitive answers, but it opened new doors, and I confess, new fear. I've always believed my role was to seek the truth, but sometimes I feel like the truth, when revealed, can be unbearable. The network that formed before me seemed faceless, nameless, just shadows that repeated themselves in different places, like an invisible stamp marking the pages of history. And so the case remains open, like a book whose final chapter has yet to be written. I know I can't stop here, because every detail points to something much bigger, but I also know that by diving into this abyss, I risk being swallowed by it. The young woman's disappearance could be just the beginning of a revelation that goes far beyond what any of us are prepared to face. If you've made it this far, you've already realized that this case isn't just about a student's disappearance. It's about the invisible scars we all carry, about how our psychology can be both a prison and a portal, and about the fact that there are mysteries that insist on reminding us that we don't have all the answers. Now I ask you, how many times have you ignored signs that were right in front of your eyes? How many times have you let silence speak louder than your intuition? Perhaps what this investigation really teaches us is that the difference between seeing the truth and not seeing it lies in how willing we are to look beyond the obvious. What if you could apply this investigative mindset to your own life? If you started questioning patterns, analyzing details, listening more to what's not being said, you might discover that much of what seems like confusion today is actually a puzzle waiting to be put together. So tell me, what would you do if you were in that young woman's shoes, receiving signs that no one else believed? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments, and of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this was just one of the many stories we'll uncover together.